Okay, in this last video, I'm just going to be taking you through some more questions to this last few dot points from chapter 4. So first of all, just want to go over that last slide from the last video. So how will output and prices respond in the event of an increase in aggregate supply? Firstly, you just want to simplify this answer to yourself and basically say, well, ultimately, output's going to increase and prices are going to go down. Okay, that's basically what you want to address. And that's because an increase in aggregate supply means we're boosting our supply potential, which means we can produce more goods and services, and that allows us to meet aggregate demand without causing inflation. So it boosts our supply potential. Basically, you think about it as firms are able to produce a greater amount, so they don't need to raise their prices when demand increases. That's likely to lead to an increase in economic activity, boost their international competitiveness, and lead to higher output, as well as reduced prices in the economy. Why does it lead to an increase in unemployment when supply shifts to the left? Basically, what you want to get at here is ignore the answer. Basically, what you want to say is that aggregate supply shifts left, we've got higher prices, and firms are less willing to supply. So it's going to lead to job losses for two reasons. One, we're less internationally competitive, so people don't want to buy our products. And two, firms are less willing to supply, so they're not going to be able to, not going to want as many workers because they're not willing to supply as much, so they're not producing as much. So next question, with reference to the aggregate demand curve and a particular example, explain why a shift in the aggregate supply curve to the right helps to reduce unemployment. So what you want to make reference to here is why does the supply curve shifting to the right reduce unemployment? And you want to make reference to an example and the aggregate demand curve. Now, without starting through the answers, basically what you want to be talking about is that demand is going to expand, or there's going to be an increase in aggregate demand because of the lower prices, and that'll create jobs. And secondly, with a particular example, you could talk about increases in productivity and how that helps to lower prices, or anything that you want to that's going to help to lower prices. So the aggregate demand shows that higher prices generally produce less, and that's because we become less internationally competitive at higher prices. A shift in the aggregate supply curve to the right means the producers are more willing and able to produce at any given price level. This increase in our productive capacity is likely to lead to lower prices. The lower price will help to boost our international competitiveness of Australian industries, which will help to boost net exports, which will then create more jobs in export and import competing industries. The increase in aggregate supply leads to lower prices, which then creates jobs in our export industries. The increase in employment will flow onto higher incomes and company profits, boosting both consumption and investment. So the idea is that once we exporting more because of our lower prices, that'll create more jobs and more consumption and investment spending as well, which should lead to increase in spending and reduced unemployment as well. Okay, what is meant by the term productivity? And explain how productivity can expand our productive capacity. Now, I've been marking a SACS, and this is probably one of the key things people need to work on, that relationship between the two of them. So productivity is the level of output per unit of input, and it basically describes how efficiently we're using our resources to produce goods and services. So output per unit of input, how efficiently we're using our land, labour and capital to produce goods and services. Productivity growth will increase a firm's willingness and ability to supply. So willingness because they've got lower cost of production, and ability because we've improved our productivity, we've improved our ability to make goods and services. That'll allow us to generate a greater volume of goods and services from fewer inputs and boost our overall supply capacity, our productive capacity. For example, so I'd ask you for an example, increase in education will make labour more productive, which will then help us to generate more volume, a greater volume of goods and services because we're working faster, which expands our overall supply potential. So the key thing here is that productivity is output per unit of input. If we boost our output per unit of input, that should boost our max capacity to supply, or our overall supply capacity. And try and use an example. If we become more educated, then that will lead to increased productivity, which boosts our overall supply potential. Okay, it's like saying if we became more educated as a class in terms of making products, so say we were making AirPods, the more educated we were, the more productive we would be in making AirPods, and that would boost our overall supply potential because essentially we can make more AirPods as a country. That's what we're meaning. How can an increase in cost of production reduce the ability and willingness of firms to produce? Provide two current examples. So for ability, basically you're talking about they're not going to be able to produce as quickly. We'll talk about that in a sec. But willingness is about their higher costs of production. So that'll go down because they're making less profits. The higher cost of production, any business can shift the individual supply curve to the left and decreases their ability to supply goods and services. For example, rising oil prices can increase the cost for companies to deliver goods to customers. That erodes their profit margins and makes them less willing to produce. So oil prices increasing is another one. Another example would be excessive wages, reduces the ability and willingness of firms to produce because their costs of production are higher, which means they'll charge higher prices and makes them less willing to supply. So your two examples are increased oil prices and increased wages, both of which make firms less willing to supply because it costs them more to produce and is likely to reduce aggregate supply. Two significant technological breakthroughs that have helped to boost aggregate supply. So driverless trucks in the mining industry is one example. So advances in technology in the mining industry have allowed for driverless trucks and trains as part of their operations. That's helped to lower labour costs, which makes them more willing to supply, reduce accidents, and that helps to boost productivity because there's less stops along the way, less stops in production. So that's one example, and you can explain how it boosts productivity, which then boosts firms' willingness and ability to supply. Second one, things like farm machinery, which means they can complete the work of 100 people in less time. So technological developments allow us to extract more oil or more gas or to do what we need to do faster, which boosts productivity as well and allows us to produce more goods and services at any given price. One factor that might increase the quality of labour resources and how this might influence the level of aggregate supply in the economy. So one factor that might boost the quality of labour is education. It's probably the most obvious one. A more educated country makes us more productive because we think of better ways to produce. We might be able to undertake more research into new technology. That will increase firms' willingness because of lower cost of production and ability because we've got better quality labour to produce, which will boost our supply potential. Okay, the next question asks you to identify one reason why the quantity of resources may have increased in Australia in recent years. For a quantity of resources, I'll be talking about the quantity of labour, and the main reason the quantity of labour has increased is because of immigration. So approximately 190,000 immigrants migrate to Australia each year. A high percentage of those migrants are skilled, so they join the labour force, which will lead to an increase in both the quantity because there's more people here and the quality of our labour resources because we're getting new skills and new ideas. So immigration is the main thing that's increased the quantity of resources in Australia. Lots of migration, a lot of immigrants coming to Australia to get jobs. Explain why a change in the exchange rate is an example of a supply side factor. So even though the exchange rate majority impacts demand, because when the exchange rate depreciates, it leads to more demand for Australian goods and services because we're more internationally competitive. The exchange rate is also a supply side factor, and that's because it affects firms' cost of production. So when the exchange rate depreciates, for example, it costs us more to buy things from overseas, which will increase the price of intermediate inputs, and will also increase the price of capital that we use in production, which will lead to firms being less willing to supply. So an depreciation of the exchange rate increase firms' cost of production. So the exchange rate is a supply side factor because it impacts cost of production, with the depreciation increasing cost of production going forward and making them less willing to supply. Explain how an increase in productive capacity is likely to impact the goal of inflation. Might skip this because we'll do that when we look at inflation. Explain how output and prices respond to an increase in aggregate supply. We've talked about that in the past, so I'll skip that. All right, living standards. So living standards, talking about the range of factors that can impact living standards in the economy. So first of all, distinguish between material and non-material living standards. It's important you've got really strong definitions of both these terms. So material living standards refers to the ability of individuals to access goods and services or their purchasing power, and it's generally measured by GDP per capita, or income per person. So material living standards, looking at access to goods and services, which is generally measured by GDP per capita or income per person. Non-material living standards are basically other quality of life factors, factors that are generally hard to measure, that also affect the satisfaction of our lives. So things like relationships, health, stress levels, congestion, quality of air. So when you're defining non-material living standards, provide a range of examples of things that impact our quality of life. In terms of economic activity and living standards, it's important you've got a good understanding of the pros and cons of increased economic activity. So when the economy grows faster and we have increased production and economic growth, it's good for material living standards because it creates more employment. So more people get a job, which means their incomes increase, which means they get access to more goods and services as a general rule. Because more people have got a job, more people get access to education, which then should flow on to them getting better jobs in the future as well. So it improves people's access to education, which then can lead to higher incomes, and it also leads to more tax revenue for the government. So when the economy is growing fast, the government collects more tax because more people have a job, companies are doing better, so there's more company tax, more spending, so more GST. and then they can use that money to provide welfare, and which will lead to people having higher transfer incomes. Benefits for non-material living standards. Increased government revenue allows for the government to provide essential services, so they can spend more money on education and healthcare. They also get more funds which they can put towards domestic violence and infrastructure. So all these things will help our health and also reduce crime rates. But it'll also can be used for infrastructure, which will reduce congestion, which will reduce travel times, which is also good for our non-material living standards because there's more time spent at home. Increased incomes to receive support, so there's more money available to help provider services like psychology services, healthcare, and things like that as well. Cost for material living standards. Economic activity can lead to inflation, particularly if it's caused by excessive demand, which will then reduce our purchasing power. And it can also lead to a more uneven distribution of income. So the idea being that basically, if we pursue increased economic growth, sometimes it can be at the result can result in increased inequality as well. Non-material living standards can lead to affluenza, so people trying to constantly pursue their needs and not ever being satisfied. It can lead to carbon emissions, which is probably the main thing, which leads to resource depletion. And often when we work harder, it can lead to more stress if we're increasing growth because we're working longer hours. Define material living standards and how an economy can boost the material living standards of citizens. It's the ability to access goods and services measured by GDP per capita. It can boost a country can boost its material living standards through purchasing power, through lower prices, but boosting economic growth. When real GDP grows faster than our population, that allows the economy to provide more goods and services and increases incomes per person. The main thing you want to focus on here is that when a country grows faster than their population growth, it leads to higher GDP per capita and higher employment as well. One reason why it might be compatible. So an increase in material living standards can come about through working longer hours. This can boost citizens' incomes, therefore giving them more purchasing power. However, it can also lead to, I've stuffed this question up, it should be incompatible. So I've talked about an incompatible relationship can lead to higher stress levels and problems with mental health and physical health. My apologies, that's the wrong way around. Define the term non-material living standards and provide one reason why an increase in material living standards can reduce non-material living standards. An increase in material living standards may reduce non-material living standards. For example, if you're working longer hours, that can lead to more stress, decreased job satisfaction, reduced happiness. So in this question, make sure you explain what non-material living standards are, and then explain that often when we boost our incomes through working harder, that can come at the expense of non-material living standards. I'll skip that one. Okay, this one's looking at environmental quality and how it can impact material living standards. So environmental quality can impact the purchasing power of citizens. For example, there's an increased extraction of oil that can lead to better material living standards because we get more incomes. I might just skip that one and come back to that in class because it's a bit wordy. Provide two examples of how reduced environmental quality may impact non-material living standards. So two reasons why a reduction in the environment can hurt non-material living standards is because pollution, depletion of natural resources can lead to lower amounts of parklands and green space, which often people use to relax and unwind. So we enjoy having nice natural resources. And an increase in air pollution can also lead to breathing problems, which makes it harder for people to, could affect people's health and therefore the overall quality of their lives as well. So reduced environmental quality can mean there's less places available for people to relax and enjoy themselves, less fresh air, and also can lead to health problems from pollution. Two examples of poorer physical and mental health may hurt material living standards, but when we have poorer physical and mental health, it reduces participation rates because less people can work. Therefore, if more people are ill, that means less people can generate an income and be part of the production process, and as a result of that, their material living standards will go down because they don't have a job. An increase in incidence of unhealthy people can also mean the government has to put more money towards healthcare. Therefore, the government may need to raise taxes to fund all that spending, and that again can lead to a decrease in our material living standards. So two reasons why if we're unhealthy, it hurts material living standards. One, people won't be able to work, and two, it may lead to higher taxes to fund people's healthcare bills, which hurts our living standards as well. Two examples of poorer physical and mental health can impact non-material living standards. It can restrict them from engaging in leisure activities. So if they've got physical disabilities, that can make it hard to engage in leisure activities, like going for a walk. An increased incidence of mental health issues can make people isolated from society, which lowers their quality of life as well. Thank you.